The night God defeated an entire army. Imagine a massive army of 185,000 soldiers advancing confidently to besiege Jerusalem. They were the Assyrians, the most feared military power of the time. Their warriors were relentless, their strategies brutal, and their victory seemed inevitable. On the other side, King Hezekiah and the people of Judah were cornered. They did not have an army capable of facing this threat. The city was surrounded, and destruction seemed only a matter of time. But the Assyrians did not count on one factor that would change everything. The God of Israel himself was about to intervene. The prophet Isaiah's warning. Even before this siege took place, the prophet Isaiah had already warned about the pride of Assyria. The empire saw itself as an invincible force, but God had already decreed that its arrogance would not last forever. Isaiah proclaimed that God would protect Jerusalem and that Assyria would not succeed in its assault. But to human eyes, this seemed impossible. How could a besieged city escape such a powerful army? What happened that night was unexpected and impressive, an event that would change the course of history and demonstrate, indisputably, that true power did not lie in the armies of the earth, but in the hands of the God who rules all nations. The Assyrian threat, the empire that wanted to destroy Jerusalem. The Assyrian Empire was the most feared of its time. Its army was unbeatable, its conquests were brutal, and its methods were ruthless. Under the command of King Sennacherib, the Assyrians had already destroyed several nations, enslaved entire peoples, and crushed anyone who dared to resist. Now, their sights were set on Jerusalem, a strategy based on fear. But the Assyrians did not attack only with swords and spears. They knew that fear was a powerful weapon. Even before the invasion began, Sennacherib sent his messenger, Rabshakeh, to weaken the morale of the people of Jerusalem. Rabshakeh did not speak in his own language, but in Hebrew, so that all the inhabitants of the city could understand his words and despair. He shouted from the walls, "Do you really think that the God of Israel can save you? Look around. All the other gods have fallen before the power of the king of Assyria. No city has resisted. No nation has survived. Do you think you'll be any different? Surrender now, and perhaps you will have a chance to live." He wanted to instill fear in the hearts of the people. He wanted them to lose faith and surrender without a fight. Defying God, Sennacherib was not just challenging King Hezekiah or the warriors of Jerusalem. He was challenging the God of Israel himself. To him, the God of the Jews was just another god, like all the other gods his army had already destroyed. He mocked the faith of the people, claiming that his military power was far greater than any divine help they could hope for. But what he did not know was that in doing so, he was not only provoking men, but declaring war on the creator of the universe himself. While the Assyrians trusted in their army, the Jews had something much greater on their side. And that night, they would see with their own eyes what happens when one defies the true God. Hezekiah's response: when faith faces fear. Faced with the Assyrian threat, any other king might have panicked, surrendered, or sought desperate military alliances. But Hezekiah chose a different path. He trusted not in armies, nor in walls, but in something much greater, the God of Israel. A cry out in the midst of despair. When Hezekiah heard the mocking words of Sennacherib and his spokesman Rabshakeh, he did not react with anger or fear. He tore his clothes in deep mourning, covered himself with sackcloth in humility, and went straight to the only place where he could find an answer, the temple of the Lord. While the people trembled before the enemy army, the king knelt before God. He knew the situation was impossible in human eyes, but he believed that the impossible was God's specialty. The prophet Isaiah enters the scene. Hezekiah needed guidance, so he sent messengers to the prophet Isaiah, the man who spoke for God. The prophet's response was clear and firm. Sennacherib will not enter this city. He will not shoot a single arrow at Jerusalem. God himself will make him retreat. While Sennacherib trusted in his weapons and threats, Hezekiah trusted in the word of the living God, the prayer that changed history. But Hezekiah didn't just receive the message and wait. He took the threatening letter the Assyrians had sent and took it to the temple. There, before the altar, he opened it and presented it before God, as if to say, "Lord, look at what they're saying about you. They're not just mocking us, they are defying your name. Show them that you are the true God." He didn't just ask to be saved, but for God to be glorified before the nations. He knew that this battle was not just political or military, it was spiritual. Now, everything was in God's hands. And that night, he would answer in a surprising way. God's answer: Assyria's fate is sealed. While the Assyrian army surrounded Jerusalem, convinced that the city would fall at any moment, something much bigger was happening behind the scenes. While Sennacherib trusted in the strength of his soldiers and mocked the God of Israel, the Creator of the universe had already decreed his end. The prophet Isaiah proclaims the divine verdict. God's response came through the prophet Isaiah. And it was not just any response. It was a sentence against the arrogance of Assyria. God made it clear that Sennacherib's power existed only because he himself had allowed it. Assyria was not invincible, it was not sovereign. It was merely a tool in the hands of God. Isaiah declared, "Do you think you have conquered nations by your own strength? Do you think it was your army that overthrew kings? It was I who allowed this to happen. But now, your pride has reached its limit, and I myself will defeat you." Assyria's fate was sealed. The city of Jerusalem would not be destroyed. No enemy soldier would set foot inside it. No arrow would be fired against its walls. God's promise: Judah will be restored. But God didn't just guarantee that Assyria would be defeated. He also made a promise for Judah's future. "My people will not be destroyed. They will go through difficult times, but they will not be exterminated. A remnant will remain and flourish again. Jerusalem will stand." What seemed like the end of Judah was just a passing phase. God's people would not be erased from history because his promises are eternal. God's sovereignty is above all kings. Assyria saw itself as an invincible nation. Its king, Sennacherib, thought he was more powerful than all the gods of the nations he conquered. But God showed that the fate of nations is not decided by kings, armies, or empires. He is the one who rules over everything and everyone. That night, Sennacherib still thought he would win, but something was about to happen. Something that would make the most powerful empire on earth bow before the God of Israel. The miracle of the night, when God defeated an army without a sword. The Assyrian army was ready to attack. 185,000 soldiers were encamped, confident that by dawn they would conquer Jerusalem without difficulty. They had destroyed countless cities before, and to them, Jerusalem was just another one. But that night, something happened, something no one could have imagined. The night the angel of the Lord acted. While the Assyrians slept confident in their victory, the angel of the Lord descended silently upon the enemy camp. There were no war cries. There was no battle. There was not even a single soldier from Judah wielding a sword. That night, 185,000 Assyrian warriors mysteriously fell. When the darkness dissipated and the sun rose, all that was left was a field strewn with bodies. The shock at dawn, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, who had spent the night fearing an attack, awoke to an unbelievable sight. From the top of the walls, they looked down on the enemy camp and saw something that defied all logic. There was no army, there were no invaders, only silence and death. What was supposed to be a day of destruction for Jerusalem became a day of supernatural deliverance. The humiliation of Sennacherib. Sennacherib, the king who had mocked God, who had defied the people of Judah and considered himself invincible, fled in despair back to Nineveh. He, who had come arrogantly to destroy, now returned humiliated, without glory and without an army. But his story did not end there. Not even within his own palace was he safe. Years later, while worshiping his god Nisroch, he was assassinated by his own sons, who conspired against him. The king who had tried to destroy Jerusalem was overthrown in his own home. The power that cannot be defied. The greatest army in the world was defeated without a single battle. The most powerful king was humbled without Jerusalem having to fight. This was not a coincidence. It was not a military trick. It was the hand of God showing that his power is above any empire, any king, any army. That night, the whole earth knew that the God of Israel is not like the idols of other nations. He is not a God of stone or wood. He lives, reigns, and fights for those who trust in him. Historical evidence. When history confirms the miracle, many people may think, did this really happen? After all, an army of 185,000 soldiers being destroyed in a single night without a battle seems unbelievable. But what makes this account even more amazing is that history confirms that something extraordinary happened. Even outside the Bible, there are historical and archaeological records that point to this event. The prism of Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, hides his defeat. The Assyrians were known for recording their conquests in detail. King Sennacherib liked to boast about his victories, and in his official records, he recorded every city he conquered and destroyed. However, on the prism of Sennacherib, a clay cylinder in which he described his military campaigns, something stands out. He mentions that he surrounded Jerusalem and imprisoned Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, but says nothing about conquering the city. This is very strange, because the Assyrians always recorded their victories. The fact that there is no record of the conquest suggests that something unexpected happened, something that the king did not want to admit. The mystery told by Herodotus. Another curious record comes from the historian Herodotus, a Greek writer from the 5th century BC. He recounts that an Assyrian army was mysteriously defeated in Egypt by a plague. He tells of how one night, rats invaded the Assyrian camp and brought a deadly plague, destroying their forces before an attack. Although Herodotus wrote about the Assyrians in Egypt and not specifically about Jerusalem, this detail is intriguing. Some scholars believe that this story may be connected to the same event reported in the Bible, as it describes an Assyrian army being suddenly and mysteriously devastated. Archaeological discoveries that support the context. In addition to the written accounts, there are also archaeological discoveries that support the context of this story. The Siloam Tunnel, built by King Hezekiah to ensure a water supply during the Assyrian siege. This tunnel was carved into the rock and still exists today, proving that Jerusalem did indeed prepare for the attack. The Assyrian reliefs of Lachish. Sennacherib had images carved of the destruction of Lachish, a city in Judah that was devastated by the Assyrians. These images show the Assyrians besieging the city and confirm the power of the Assyrian army at the time. But once again, there is no representation of the conquest of Jerusalem, which reinforces the idea that something prevented them from winning. The God who fights for us. The story of Jerusalem being besieged by the Assyrians is not just an ancient story. It is living proof that God cares for those who trust in him. The God who never changes. The same God who defeated an entire army without his people needing to lift a sword is still the same today. He continues to hear prayers, continues to protect those who turn to him, and continues to show that his power is above any threat. The challenges change. Today we do not face armies of armed warriors, but we deal with problems that seem as big as 185,000 soldiers surrounding a city. Financial difficulties, illnesses, fears, insecurities, emotional battles. All of these can surround us like Sennacherib surrounded Jerusalem. But God's answer is still the same. He continues to say, if God is for us, who can be against us? Romans 8 verse 31. A trust that cannot be shaken. Hezekiah did not trust in his own strength, in human strategies, or in political alliances. He trusted in the Lord, and that trust made all the difference. He knew that when God fights for someone, no matter how big the threat, victory is already assured. The Lord is our strength and refuge, a very present help in trouble. Psalm 46 verse 1. This is the truth we need to remember every day. The call to trust like Hezekiah, like the king of Judah. We need to learn to take our problems to God before anything else. Before we look for human solutions, before we despair, before we give up, we need to get down on our knees and present the situation before him. Hezekiah did not see deliverance immediately. He had to wait, trust, and keep his faith firm. But when God did act, it was in a surprising way. Today, the question remains, are you willing to trust in this way? Because the truth is that God still fights for those who believe in Him.